Wonderful. Well, for those of you that I see some unfamiliar names on here, want to let you all know about the Chicago Archaeological Society. So from what I understand of oral tradition, we started meeting somewhere around 100 years ago. So people in the Chicagoland area were interested in archaeology, anthropology, and history. And way back when, we had one of the first female archaeologists in the whole country as part of our group, Harriet Smith, who did work at Cahokia. That was back in the 1940s, I believe. And then in the 1960s, we started using the name, the Chicago Archaeological Society. Somewhere towards the end of the 1960s, beginning in the 1970s, we joined the IAAA, which is the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. So there's groups like ours all over the state of Illinois that want to encourage the interest in archaeology. Our mission at the CES is to have a greater understanding of the existence of humankind, mankind, and the IAAA's mission is very similar, but more focused on the regional archaeology and ancient Illinois. But now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Ruggieri to talk about and introduce our speaker.
All right. Let me find my notes here real fast. The Chicago Archaeological Society is very proud to announce to you today that our special speaker is one who is very, very distinguished in his field. Perhaps the most premier Aztec expert in the country, if not the world, Dr. Michael E. Smith, who's a professor of archaeology and the director of the ASU, Arizona State University Teotihuacan Research Laboratory. He also teaches at the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. He's an affiliate faculty member of the School of Geological Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He has extensive experience excavating at Aztec sites. He is an archaeologist with two research themes: the Aztecs, Teotihuacan, and other societies in ancient central Mexico and comparative urbanism. He has directed fieldwork projects at numerous sites in the provinces of the Aztec Empire and central Mexico. His fieldwork focuses on the excavation of houses and the study of daily life of the Aztecs and their empire. He has published 7 books and numerous scholarly articles on the Aztecs. By numerous, I mean a lot of articles, perhaps 50 articles. His books include the award-winning At Home with the Aztecs, which he is going to be speaking of today. So thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for joining us, for being part of the Chicago Archaeological Society presentations, and we are ready to hear your expertise.
Thanks, Mike, for that very nice introduction. And hey, Jan, to my sister out there. So I guess I can share my screen now.
Yes, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, so can you see this guy, the most interesting man in the world? Is that
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for this invitation. You know, I taught at Loyola University from 1982 to 1990, and I participated with this organization during my time at Loyola. And so it's a pleasure to be, even if I can't be in Chicago, to be participating here. So this book here, I want to talk a little bit about the context of it. It's different from my other books. I think I have something like 15 books, and most of them are either technical reports, like the site report on the right here, which have all the gory details of excavations. If you want to know how many figurines we found, or how deep were our excavations, or how many houses did we test, this will tell you that. And nobody wants to read this except a few archaeologists. So actually, they don't even want to read it. They just probably want to look at it for specific information. And then I have general books. This Aztec City-State Capitals is another one, which is sort of for an academic and audience, and it's not too badly written, I don't think, but it's not for the public. I had a sabbatical in 2012, and I had directed several excavation projects in the Mexican state of Morelos at Aztec sites, and published the site reports and a bunch of articles. I thought I would pull it all together. And my first thought was to do an academic book, because that's what I know how to do. And then I thought, well, if I did that, more than half, maybe 3/4 of what that would be in that book had already been published. And so I thought, well, what if I write a book for the general public? Might that be interesting? I hadn't done that before. And I thought, well, how do you do that? And I thought, well, Norton Press, that would be ideal. So I go to the website of Norton Press, and I was actually dog sitting at my in-laws at the time in Texas. I go to the website of Norton Press and say, we don't deal with authors, we only deal with agents. I go, agents? What the heck? How do you do that? And so there's all this stuff on the internet, how you get a literary agent. And they specialize in topics, and I had to send off little blurbs to a lot of agents, and they all sent back a thing saying, sorry, this isn't commercial enough. It's not going to make enough money. I'm not interested. Sorry. That was rather depressing, till finally one agent, Barbara Braun in New York, said, I like this idea of your book. And I think, speaking of general books, this one's coming out in a couple of months, Urban Life in the Distant Past. But she said, I like this book, but you need some help with your writing. She said, your writing is clear, but not vivid. And I thought, well, that's pretty good for an academic, because many of my colleagues can't even write clearly, much less vividly. So, well, how do I get help with my writing? Turns out there was an organization somehow affiliated with my university called Creative Nonfiction. It doesn't mean making things up. It means writing nonfiction in a more literary narrative style. And so I contacted the guy. I'd heard a workshop of his, and he said, well, you should try one of our writing mentors. And we did this for one chapter and eventually for the whole book. And it was quite interesting. It's not a case where I wrote it and she rewrote my prose. She would show me how to write in a narrative fashion. It's very different from academic writing. All right, academic writing. Here's the topic I'm going to talk about. Here's why it's important. Here's what other people have said about this topic. Here's what I'm going to do. Here are my methods. And with narrative writing, you start with a topic and you say, here's what I have to say about it. It's sort of journalistic in style. And so I rewrote the whole thing under her guidance. And then my agent said, okay, I'll sign a contract. And then I rewrote it again from the point of view of my agent. And one of the things they both said is I needed more stories. I needed personal stories, because this is a book about my wife and I doing archaeology in Mexico and raising our kids. And yeah, I had lots of stories. So I started adding stories to it. In fact, I interviewed my daughters and said, do you have any good stories about when we were in Mexico? And I learned some things that we didn't know were going on at the time. And so the result is, this is a damn well written book, if I do say so myself. In fact, it won an award, the Society of American Archaeology, best general audience archaeology book. And unfortunately, we had trouble getting a publisher. Norton and my agent shopped it around the major New York publishers, and she shared with me the correspondence, and they were all pretty much the same. They'd get to an acquisitions editor who would reply after some time, this book looks really interesting. I'd love to read it, but the marketing people say it's not going to sell enough, so we don't want to do it. And finally, it got accepted by Routledge Press, which is an academic publisher. They put it out with a absurdly high price. It's a thin thing. It's not really thick, but it's well written. So, and I have some illustrations by a graphic artist, Keegan McLeod, who's a Toronto graphics artist, and very nice illustrations illustrating aspects of life that are in the book. So the book tells three stories. Tells about the Aztec households and communities whose remains we excavated. It's about doing archaeology in Mexico. How do you find sites? How do you dig sites? What do you do with all that stuff? And it's about raising our kids in Mexico. So the Aztecs have somewhat of an image problem. People think, empire and conquest, or they think human sacrifice and blood, and isn't that awful? And yes, they did have warfare, and yes, they did have human sacrifice, but it didn't dominate their lives. It didn't dominate their culture. But the written sources about the Aztecs are really sort of biased. They tell us about the 1%. They tell us about the rich and famous, the kings and the nobles. And the written sources say very little about ordinary people. So one of the most important written sources on the Aztecs is a Sahagún, Friar Bernardino Sahagún. Here's what he says about farmers. The farmer is bound to the soil. He works the soil. He broadcasts seeds. I mean, this is ridiculous. Of course, farmers work the soil. You know, what does this tell us? Nothing. What Sahagún has to say about farmers is not at all useful or interesting. So how do we learn about Aztec farmers? Well, that's where archaeology comes in. We excavate the places where Aztec farmers lived and worked, and that's one of the big contributions of archaeology. Now, you know, there's old-time monumental archaeology. Archaeology got started in the areas of ancient states with, you know, digging the pyramids and the palaces and opening the tombs. Here's, you know, Howard Carter with King Tut's tomb in the lower right there. Excavations here at Persepolis and Egypt. And monumental archaeology continues today. Here's an opening of a Maya tomb and excavations in Egypt. Indiana Jones, yeah, sort of monumental, well, weird archaeology. But the kind of archaeology that I do, which is increasingly important, you can call social archaeology, which is archaeology to learn about the lives of people in the past and something about past societies. This is a excavation at Kalixtlahuaca, and it's a project I won't be talking about today. So I met my wife, Cindy, in graduate school, and she's worked on all of my projects, and sometimes in the field, sometimes in the lab. Here we are in our younger days, horsing around with some burial vessels. If there's any museums, collections, people in the crowd, pretend you didn't see this picture. I'm playing around with these vessels. Actually, one time we hired a guy to work on our potsherds who was an out-of-work political cartoonist in Cuernavaca in Mexico. So he did this cartoon of, here we are, out to find the treasure. People think in Mexico, they think we're doing archaeology to find treasure, to find buried gold. So in this case, I'm sitting there clueless, trying to figure it out, and Cindy's already found the treasure chest. Tenochtitlan in the middle was the Aztec capital. That's where Mexico City is today. And the sites I'll be talking about are in the Mexican state of Morelos, Quechcomate, Yautepec, circled here. So this first excavation, we dug a town, Quechcomate, and a village, Capilco. And the questions we were asking was, what was rural society like? What were these farmers like? And what were the effects of Aztec conquest? The Aztec Empire came in and conquered this area. What difference did it make? Did it have a major effect or not much of an effect? We had some assumptions which turned out to be false. First is that these farmers, these peasants would be very poor and isolated, and that they were heavily exploited by local kings and by the Aztec Empire. And we were to find out that these things were not true. I was teaching at Loyola University of Chicago at the time. You know, I got this photograph off the internet and I looked, I go, I don't recognize that campus. Where's my building? Damon Hall was torn down. And this campus looks quite a bit different from when I taught there. But, you know, that was a good time. The basketball team was doing real well at the time, made the Sweet 16 in 1983. And so here we are at one of these sites, Capilco, and here's an Aztec house. Can you see it? These guys are starting work. They're clearing off the surface. And what you have here is a wall, stone alignments form a wall, and then a pile of junk, which is stones from the walls and deteriorating adobe that have piled up inside the house and are sort of falling apart. So we did two kinds of excavations. Some were complete house excavations. We didn't do too many of those because they take a lot of time, but we did a lot more test excavations. We took a sample of the houses and put a 2x2 meter excavation across a wall, which gave us some of the interior area on the left there with a stone floor. and exterior area. There were some mysteries as we got going. The first one was students started to come up with what they said was copper wires. And I didn't want to see copper wires in the excavations. If there was copper wire, that would mean that these were not Aztec deposits. They were either colonial or modern deposits. But these things turned out not to be copper wire. They were sewing needles. And they're not just copper, but they're bronze. It's an alloy of copper and arsenic, copper and tin. And these sewing needles were turning up in basic trash deposits around these Aztec farmers' houses. These are the two sites. Capilco is a small village with 20 houses, and Quechcomate is a town with about 150 houses. It's also got a temple and a couple of elite residences in the middle there where it says B. So here's one of the houses. Cindy excavated this one at Quechcomate. So it had a stone floor in the middle. On top of the stone floor, we think was a surface of sand. The stone wall foundations, and the stone wall foundations went up maybe a foot or two above the surface. This is excavated down to what had been the Aztec period ground surface. And here's Cindy with her crew of local workers from the village of Tetlama. And so we're trying to figure out, well, what were the walls of these houses like? Were they stone all the way up? I mean, at Teotihuacan, for example, houses had stone walls, so the stone went all the way up to the roof. Or maybe it was something else. And we're sitting around talking about this. We had US students, we had some Mexican students, and so we're speaking English, Spanish, whatever. And we're speaking about in Spanish, what could the walls be? Were the stone all the way, what was on top of the stone if the stones didn't go all the way up? And one guy, this guy, one of Cindy's workers, Angel, said, any idiot knows these were the foundation walls for adobe brick walls. Well, okay, we're gringo idiots. Show us how this works. And in the village of Tetlama today, where most of our workers were from, there's many adobe houses, and the adobe brick houses, these are adobe bricks, sun-dried mud bricks, thatched roof. They're sitting on a foundation of stones. And it turns out that the stone walls, here's a guy building a house, are identical to the stone walls that we excavated. And in fact, the technology that he's using here is the same technology the Aztecs would have used. It's a mud mortar. He's got strings. The only thing different, one of the only things that's significantly different is he's got a carpenter's level to keep the lines level. But, you know, the Aztec builders of the original houses could have stretched out strings, and the walls look the same. 2 rows of stones held together by mud mortar. So here's our April and Heather, daughters on the right here, on Easter in Mexico. There was one point when we figured, I mean, I was teaching in Loyola, but we were going to Mexico quite a bit, sometimes spending a whole year there, that they had spent more of their time, more of their lives in Mexico than in the US. And here's Heather's first boyfriend. And it looks like she's trying to tell him to do something, and he's probably saying, no quiero, I don't know. Second mystery. Oops, pardon me. Second mystery. What were these stone walls? There were stone walls sort of all over these sites, rough stone walls, and we were trying to figure out what they were. It turns out they were agricultural terraces. So on the map here, these walls went down the lines of a little ravine here. And in the diagram on the left, on the map on the left, originally the ravine had sharp walls, steep walls there, but by putting these stone walls across the flow of the water, soil was trapped behind the walls and created planting surfaces. So that's the way the direction of water flow. So here's what it looks like in cross section. We excavated a few of these things. They're called check dams. People sometimes say, well, how did those walls stand up? It's sloping. Well, it was never a freestanding wall. Let me show you how this worked. The stream is flowing that way. We're looking across the channel. And this is a pretty cheesy graphic, but it shows what I want to show. The farmers would put stones across in a line, and sediment would build up behind them. And what that did is that gradually created both a deeper field that could be planted, but also a larger field, because as it got deeper, it spread out across the walls of the ravine. And after a number of seasons, there were quite a few stones here, and you had a significant terrace wall. So all the sediment in here had been trapped behind the wall here, and it actually goes deeper than this today. So these were agricultural terraces. They were an intensive agricultural method that was needed to feed all the people who lived in this area in Aztec times. The Aztec period was the sort of demographic height in this area before the Spanish conquest. And when you have lots of people in an area, and when you have state level organization, you need intensive agricultural methods to produce enough food to feed everybody. A lot of our excavation concentrated on middens. Middens are trash heaps, and we found that most of the houses had a midden behind it. So these three houses are grouped around a patio. There's rock piles. We'll get to those in a minute. And if you dig behind the houses, you get trash. And archaeologists love trash, not sort of modern smelly trash. But when trash is sat in the ground for a few hundred years, it doesn't stink anymore. And it's mostly consists of potsherds and flakes of stone tools. You also get some animal bones and bronze sewing needles and little things like that. But from this trash, we can reconstruct the activities that took place in those buildings. So here we are, students measuring spindle walls and recording obsidian and so on. The site of Queshcomate had a group of mounds you see in the photograph there, and we put some test pits, and it turns out it was a bunch of structures on a platform that turned out to be an elite residence. And also had rock piles, and these were a little bit enigmatic at first. They were piles of rock, generally in the plazas of patio groups. And what they consisted of are broken ceramic vessels with rocks piled on top. And we think this corresponds to a ceremony the Aztecs had called the New Fire Ceremony. Every 52 years, their calendar repeated. It was like a century in our calendar. Every 52 years, sort of you start a new calendar, new round of the calendar. And according to Sahagún and some other sources, everybody threw out all their possessions. So here's a guy throwing out his household pots and pans. The thing that looks like a devil is probably meant to be a ceramic figurines. And they would start over with new ceramic vessels. And I think this holiday must have been sponsored by the vessel makers, by the potters, right? Like Hallmark sponsors holidays today. And we think these rock piles are evidence of this activity. In this one case, these sherds right here were from a very odd kind of vessel, this weird pot. It took quite a while to figure out just what this thing was. It looks sort of like a jar, but jars never have a base like that. And it's got a hole in the side. And finally figured out that this was a drum. You would put the skin across the top, and the hole was a sounding hole. Here's another Aztec drum on the left. This is from an offering in Mexico City. And also musical instruments. Now, we didn't find nice entire whistles and flutes like this, but we found fragments of them. These are all pieces of flute excavated in basic household trash. People had these things in their houses. I contacted a guy, one of the world's experts on Aztec musical instruments, a German music archaeologist. And I told him we had all this stuff in household deposits. He says, you can't. These were ritual deposits. These things are only found in temples and ritual deposits. I said, nope, I'm sorry. They're found in household trash. He says, I've got to see these things. So he came over and studied them. And yes, indeed, there were a variety of musical instruments, flutes, whistles, drums, and things found in household contexts. they grew a lot of cotton. Cotton grows in this area. We found pollen from cotton in some of the deposits, and cotton textiles were a form of money in the Aztec economy. And to spin cotton by hand, you use a whorl, which is a weight that goes around the spindle that twirls, and a little ceramic bowl. And these are the weights and the bowls. And you can sort of see that the base of the bowls show evidence of abrasion, that they've been worn. And that's probably from the spinning, from the spindle twirling inside the bowl. So these people were making cotton textiles at home. It's like making, printing $100 bills in your basement. Only it wasn't illegal. And that's one source of prosperity for these people. So cotton textiles were large bills. The sort of small change in Aztec money was, I don't have a slide of this, were cacao beans. I don't know if you can see these things. I got cacao beans here that I ordered from Amazon.com. And they were the small change in the Aztec economy. We also found bark beaters. They took the bark of the wild amate tree and made paper out of it, which they used for books. Today, this kind of bark paper they still make it with the same methods, but they paint it with birds and flowers and sell it to tourists. Lots of evidence for tortilla griddles, comals, bean pots. And there's Cindy making tortillas. It's interesting. In this village, we got to know some of the people. We have compadres among them. And when they have a special meal, like a fiesta, they make the tortillas by hand. They don't normally make them by hand, but they make the tortillas by hand and even grind the corn. And the technology here is almost the same as it was in the Aztec period. There's a metate in the lower right. I mean, the beer bottle is new. Obviously, the Aztecs didn't have beer bottles, but they did have an alcoholic beverage, pulque. But there's a metate. The comal, cooking the tortillas on the fire, is basically the same as an Aztec comal. Here's a big pot in the foreground where they're making mole. The cast aluminum tortilla press is a modern invention. The Aztec women would have made their tortillas just by patting their hands together. And we participated in various events in the village. Here's our daughter Heather participating in a wedding. She and her little friend there are carrying the train from the bride. So here's a story, that one thing that we learned interviewing the girls when I was writing the book. Boiling water was a big deal for us. Bottled water wasn't as readily available in Mexico back then as it is now, and we were constantly boiling water. And we just to drink water, told the kids, don't drink the water from the tap. Brush your teeth with boiled water. If you take a shower, keep your mouth closed. It was like a big deal, a major part of our routine. There was this one period when the girls were really sick. Quite sick. I remember Heather was, I don't know, maybe she was pretty young, 5 or 6 years old. She was so sick she couldn't walk. I had to carry her to the doctor. We went to a different pediatrician. One was on our street, and feeding her Pedialyte by spoon. And she was just really sick for a while. And we never figured out why. I mean, kids get sick in Mexico and whatever. We didn't know why they were so sick until I'm writing the book and asking the kids, and and they said, well, you know why we were so sick for a while then? Why was that? We were drinking water from the hose, from the garden hose. I said, man, why did you do that? Because we weren't supposed to. So what's the most spectacular find you've ever made? If you're an archaeologist, you get asked this all the time. You're on an airplane, you tell, what do you do? You're an archaeologist. Oh, how fascinating. What's the coolest thing you've ever found? And when this happens, people want you to say, oh, I found an army of terracotta warriors. Or, oh, I found a gold sarcophagus lid. That's the kind of thing they want you to say as an archaeologist. And at first I would, when I was younger, I would say, well, that's not the kind of archaeology I do. And I excavate peasant households and we don't get fancy stuff and blah, blah, blah. Well, now I tell people, these are the most exciting things I've ever excavated. These are sewing needles. And they might not seem very fancy, but really they tell us quite a bit about the past. First of all, bronze was one of the advanced technologies of ancient Mexico. And we've had these analyzed by a colleague at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and we know the alloy and precisely how they were made technologically. They were very advanced. Second of all, we know they were only made in the western part of Mexico, what's now Michoacan or Nayarit, Jalisco. And so these had to be traded into central Mexico. So these are farmers living in a rural area under the Aztec Empire, and they're getting trade goods from far away. And they also tell us something about what people are doing, their technology and producing textiles. So for me, these are some of the most spectacular finds I've made are these little sewing needles. So basically, we found that these people were more prosperous, and in trying to figure out how do we think about this prosperity, I use the work of Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize-winning economist, who said the quality of life is based on two things. First of all, wealth or income, and second of all, the capabilities. Quality of life is a function of how fully and vigorous an individual exercises his human capabilities. Well, how do we do this archaeologically? Well, for wealth, we want to look at standard of living, which is something archaeologists have done for a while. And for capabilities, I devised measures based on the diversity of possessions and external social networks. So for the diversity of possessions, let's illustrate. Here's a woman who is a curer. And when she was going to do a ceremony, she could use ceramic figurines. She could use censers, ceramic incense burners, different kinds of censers. She could use little ceramic stamps to make designs on the body. She could use quartz crystals. She could use a whole variety of things. She had a choice of different kinds of things to use for a ceremony. And it's this matter of having a choice of having lots of options. That's a measure of sort of the quality of life. She could also use a parrot head. This is part of a figurine. And long before Jimmy Buffett fans became known as the parrot heads, the Aztecs had parrot heads. You know, and this is not the only element of popular culture today that the Aztecs were ahead of their time. The hairstyle of Alice on Dilbert. Where did she get that hairstyle? Where did Scott Adams get that hairstyle? Well, there's an Aztec figurine. That's where it came from, obviously. I have actually no evidence that he ever looked at an Aztec figurine, but another aspect of capabilities, external connections. There were a lot of imports here. People were connected to distant areas by trade for ceramics and obsidian. Here's the artist's reconstruction of Marketplace at Queshcomate with the vendors have things set out for people to purchase. Another aspect of connections is style. People knew about styles throughout the Aztec Empire. These ceramic figurines are sort of cool, and there were three different categories. One were imported from the Valley of Mexico. Why were they imported? Because they look just like the figurines from the Aztec capital and its area, and the clay is not like the local clay. It's the clay from the Valley of Mexico. The second group, and this is the biggest group in terms numerically, is that they were the Aztec style. They looked like the figurines from the Valley of Mexico, but made with local clays. How do we know they were made locally? Well, the clay is local, and we found molds. So there's a figurine of a standing woman with a skirt with diamond patterns, and we found a mold for that, or a fragment of a mold. And then there's somewhere local style. But the point is, people were aware of different styles from throughout the Aztec Empire. Well, when the Aztecs conquered this area, how did Aztec conquest affect provincial peoples? Well, actually, only very minor changes in these things. The elite compound was replaced by a smaller one, and people did have to pay imperial taxes. And they're recorded in these documents. This is the Codex Mendoza, showing the taxes paid by the people in this area. But what did people get in exchange for paying their taxes to the Aztec Empire? Not much. This was a giant protection racket. The Aztec Empire was like the mafia, right? Make your payments and I won't break your leg. That's basically what the Aztec emperors said to these provincial peoples. They got very little in return. They didn't get constructions or public goods or anything. They weren't invaded again. So the next project is Yautepec. I moved on from Loyola, was teaching at SUNY Albany, and we went to excavate in Yautepec, an urban site nearby. And we thought that urban life would be very different from rural life, and found out that, well, no, that wasn't the case. They were quite similar. And some of the research questions: what was the nature of urban society? And again, what were the effects of Aztec conquest? This was the royal palace of Yautepec. It was being excavated by a Mexican team. And while they were excavating, we were working on the artifacts from Cuescomante and Capilco, visited the excavation, and they said, why don't you guys come dig houses? We'll be digging here at the pyramid. You can dig houses. And so we started off with an urban survey, summer of 1992, went through the entire modern town of Yautepec, and found the extent of the Aztec town underneath the modern town, in the fields right around at Yautepec, as well as walking through the city itself. The Yautepec Archaeological Zone. This was a government archaeological zone right across the street, right next to the royal palace that was being excavated. And this is what it looked like when we left in August '92. We made plans to come back in January and excavate houses here. And we got back, and oops, this is what it looked like. There had been an invasion in September. And when we arrived in January of '93, there were all these little shacks there. This is a big political thing. It's sort of a land grab. It's an organized activity in Mexico. People are called paracaidistas, parachuters. According to Mexican law, if people show up overnight and build a house, they have some rights to that land, even though this was government land, a government archaeological site. Here's Yautepec. There's the palace area in blue, and that area outlined in yellow had been entirely open fields that we had planned to excavate. Well, guess what? We didn't excavate there, but we did find other places to dig. There was on the top there a schoolyard, and a couple of other places, and then other areas to excavate further out from the center of Yautepec. Here's a house in the schoolyard. It was a low platform of stone. You can see some of the white plaster that had been on the stone walls here. Here are some features out here. These are burials, entierro, several burials out in this area over here, and some storage pits. Here's another house, and there's Cindy bending over and measuring. Half of it had been destroyed by plowing. But right outside this house here was a very, very dense deposit of artifacts, very useful. Now, right across this wall here is the area where the squatters were living, and they became very active politically, and were in the news quite a bit. Demandan a paracaidistas, up against the wall, invaders of the archaeological zone. They were petitioning. They would marched on the State House in Cuernavaca, and they said, you should give us services, put in electricity, put in plumbing, give us title to this land that we stole. And the government was trying to evict them, and we were sort of stuck in the middle of it. We were in the news quite a bit. We always had reporters around. Here's student Norris trying to map with a TV crew. We were on the Mexican version of 60 Minutes, 60 Minutos. And, is the government going to be able to kick these people out? And there were rumors that someone was getting paid off. And I'd be interviewed, and I had to watch out. They'd say, are those squatters living on the archaeological site? Yes. Are they destroying archaeological remains? Yes. Should they be removed? No comment. I wanted to avoid publicity saying, gringo archaeologists said people should be kicked out of their homes. And I did manage to avoid that. But the squatters are still there, and it just became part of the city of Yautepec. At one point, they hopped over into this walled area when Sue was there with her crew of workers, and they didn't threaten her so much as threatened her workers. They said, you should stop working for these gringos or we're going to beat you up. And they complained to the local political party. Word got through to the governor, and the governor sent the state police to guard us. And these are guys in bright blue uniforms with shotguns who normally would stand around bored outside of banks. So they came to guard us. So we put them to work. It was more interesting to help excavate than to stand around doing nothing. When we finished with this excavation and moved farther away from where the squatters were, I said, we don't need police protection anymore. I had to sign a letter to that effect, to say if something happens, it's not the governor's fault. And we did not have any sort of problem with anybody getting hurt or harassed after this. The kids, there's daughter April by the screen. She doesn't look too excited by that. And see if you can spot the gringa in the back of the truck. We brought the kids went to a day camp at the Seguro Social in Yautepec, and so there were a bunch of her pals there. We excavated a house in a street. A public works crew was grading dirt road here. Came across a pavement, and they were trying to figure out, is this a modern cement pavement or is this an Aztec plaster pavement? And came to us and we excavated, and yeah, it was an Aztec house. Identical houses to those we excavated at the rural sites. We gave lots of lectures to school groups because we were actually excavating in 2 schoolyards, secondary school in the lower right there. And then on the top left is a primary school where we put in some test pits. Major sort of public education component to this project. Here's our lab in Yautepec. It's the upstairs part of a private residence. So the major findings, these people, these commoners whose houses we excavated were also prosperous and well-connected. So they seem to be successful households and communities. Well, how do we study sort of success and prosperity at the community level? How can archaeologists do that? Not just the individual household level, but the community level. Well, several things we looked at. This is Capilco. One is collective construction projects. If you have collective construction projects that benefit the whole community, that suggests prosperity and success. And that's what we found at these sites. Here's a reconstruction of digging some terrace walls and an irrigation canal. The second thing is continuity of residence. Each vertical bar here is one house from the 3 periods: settlement, growth, imperial. This is like early Aztec, late Aztec, and then the Spanish period. And the point here is that once a house was occupied, they all continued at least till the Spanish conquest. In Yautepec, several continued on, but houses weren't abandoned. People settled in a place and they stayed there, which is a sort of a sign that they were doing well. The only house at all that was abandoned is this one elite compound at Quescomate that was abandoned, and they built another elite compound. Another element of prosperity is longevity. Capilco lasted for 450 years. Quescomate was founded later, lasted for 250 years until the Spanish conquest. And Yautepec's still going. It continued after the Spanish conquest to a colonial town, and it's still a vibrant city today. And the final element of prosperity is resilience to imperial conquest. It's sort of a weird diagram here. What it means is when the Aztec armies conquered this area, there was very little effect, almost no effect at all in Capilco, and very minor effects at Quescomate and Yautepec. So they were resilient to Aztec conquest. Didn't really bother them. They adapted just fine. But Spanish conquest was another matter. Capilco and Quescomate were wiped out after the Spanish conquest. They were abandoned. Yautepec had major sort of disruptions, major changes. So they were not resilient to the Spanish conquest. So how do we explain this prosperity or success of these households and communities? Well, there's one more piece of evidence. So I'll let you read the text here for a minute. I'm sure you're all reading this, right? Does this make sense? No, this is in Nahuatl, the Aztec language. If you can read this, you're better than I am. I cannot read Nahuatl. This is from some remarkable census documents compiled shortly after the Spanish conquest, where agents went around to individual houses and interviewed people about who lived there, what kind of occupation did they have, how much land did they have, and so on. And what we learned from these is the importance of something called the Kaupuli. And a Kaupuli is an organization of commoners, and the Kaupuli sort of controls its lands. Now, the land was technically owned by a noble. Commoners couldn't own land. A noble owned the land, but basically the noble would let the Kaupuli run things. So a Kaupuli council made decisions: who can farm, and can you farm this way or not that way, or they would decide who got to farm which plot. And as long as the members of the Kaupuli were paying their rent and their taxes to the noble, they could manage their own affairs. And so what this here's a Kaupuli temple on the left. On the right is a Kaupuli school. Look at that. Looks like a school today. You know, here's dad. He's bringing the kids. There's a teacher. He's got this like net cape thing on, and he's dropping the kids off at school. But the Kaupuli provided local control and flexibility. People didn't have to depend on nobles to tell them what to do or to do things for them. They could figure out how to farm, what lands to farm. They could work those decisions out on their own. So the households and communities in this area were very successful. They had resources such as cotton and the other things they were able to farm. They had economic networks, and we know all this from archaeology, the imports and so on. But we know from the documents about the flexible organization and the local control. I have an article about this. This is sort of interesting in writing this book. This whole thing on the success and prosperity, I worked this out while writing this book. And most of the other things in this book, I had already, it was in the site reports, it was in articles, and I was sort of reinterpreting it for the context of this book. But this was new material, and I couldn't let go of it enough. Since this was new material, I thought people are going to be reading this, and I've got to make an academic case for it. And so these descriptions in the book were just radically different from everything else. And people said, you got to change the style of these things. This doesn't go along with the rest of the book. So I knew what I had to do. I had to write a technical article. And then once that out of the way, then I can sort of relax and write the general audience version of this. And so here's the technical article of 2019, Quality of Life and Prosperity. And then I went back and rewrote this stuff in the book. So the main messages of this book are that the Aztecs were not sacrificial maniacs. I didn't say anything about sacrifice, did I? Well, what evidence did we find of human sacrifice? None at all. One offering of a skull with a cervical vertebra that suggests decapitation. And that wasn't even something we excavated. It was something someone gave to us while we were excavating. This sacrifice took place at least in the imperial capital, but out in the countryside, in the provinces, we have no evidence for it. So they certainly weren't sacrificial maniacs. Archaeology can reconstruct households and communities in the past. We find the artifacts, and we can use these artifacts to say something socially. And these provincial households and communities achieved a successful and sustainable ways of life. And that was very different from going into this whole thinking these were sort of poor, oppressed, isolated peasants. Well, they're really doing pretty well. So buy this book. Shameless commercial advertising here. There's some lessons today. Small is beautiful. Appropriate technology can get the job done. These people were very successful on a very limited technology. And networks are important. Choose the right connections. That's one reason these people were very successful, was the economic networks and the style networks that they participated in. And local control and flexibility are keys to success in this area. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take some questions or have some discussion now. Thank you. I think I will stop sharing. And
wonderful presentation. So now at this point, if you'd like to add questions in chat, or if you feel comfortable to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do so and ask questions.
Yeah, in the chat, the bronze must be after 1000 CE. Yeah, they are. And you know, these artifacts, you know, I contacted Dorothy Hostler at MIT, and she got all excited because she had studied quite a few bronze artifacts from sites in Mesoamerica, but they were all in museum collections. They were all been looted. And so these little sewing needles, we have little bells and other little bronze things that we found, is one of the biggest collections of metal artifacts in Mesoamerica from an actual excavation where we have good context and good dating on these things. So ear spools, yes. Well, the figurines, people probably had, we found some ear spools. While we were digging in Yautepec, an article came out in the journal Ancient Mesoamerica saying, showing how ear spools were made of obsidian, how the Aztecs made ear spools of obsidian, saying, but it's only evidence of this taking place in one place, which was the city of Otumba. Well, we actually found evidence for the production of ear spools from obsidian. So was land ownership a form of wealth, says Jessica, my sister-in-law. Well, yes, definitely. I mean, there were restrictions on land ownership, and that nobles were the ones allowed to own land, although it said they allowed commoners to use the land. Is this why there were guards with machine guns? No, they were shotguns, not machine guns. Migrants with rights. Her 8-year-old childhood memories. Sacrifice happened in other. Well, I'm not saying sacrifice didn't happen. You know, there are. You know, some views of the Aztecs say, oh, they did sacrifice all the time. Well, they didn't do all that much of it. But there's other views of the Aztecs saying they didn't really do sacrifices. The Spaniards just made that up. Well, I'm sorry. There's enough excavated context in Tenochtitlan, in the site of Tlatelolco, that they did definitely carry out human sacrifices. My point is these were not done in the provincial area where I was excavating. Do we know that access to polychrome ceramics and bronze were sumptuary rules? Excellent question. Sumptuary rules, you know, are that certain things are limited to certain classes. For example, Sahagun and others said that only nobles could wear cotton clothing and only nobles could have 2-story houses. Now, what we found was that even the fanciest stuff we found, these bronze needles, imported polychrome pottery, the most valuable and restricted goods that we found were not limited to the noble households. The commoners could have them too. But the thing was, the nobles had more of them. So there's a quantitative difference in the amount of imports, the amount of decorated pottery, the amount of, you know, jade beads and things like this. Nobles had more of it than commoners, but commoners could get this stuff. And what that means is that it was probably obtained through a market system. I didn't say much about markets, but the Aztecs had a system of periodic markets. People bought goods with money, with, you know, cotton textiles and cacao beans. And, you know, if you were a commoner doing well, you could buy fancy goods. They weren't all necessarily limited to the elite. Tlaxcala's egalitarianism. Well, yeah, Tlaxcala, politically, Tlaxcala was more collective in its rule and more, I don't know whether it was more egalitarian in terms of wealth, but the form of rule was different in Tlaxcala than in other places. How different was commoner inequality compared to, that's complicated. But it's a good question. The level of inequality at different sites. Bells, do you have bells? Well, we found some bronze bells. Are they in the book? I'm sure I talk about them at least a little bit. If you want the nitty-gritty, the site reports have descriptions of all the bells that we found. Little jingle bell things. Evidence of sacred landscape. Well, how would you know the landscape was sacred? I'm skeptical about a lot of work that says that ancient people thought their landscapes were sacred. How would you tell that? How would you know? It's, I'm an empirical kind of guy. I want evidence for things. So other questions? Extent of trade goods in rural community. There was a lot of imports. This really surprised me. I didn't think there'd be quite so many. And every household had imported obsidian. Every household had some imported pottery. Most household, not well, a fair number of them had imported bronze goods. Imports were really pretty common. And one of the reasons was these market systems. They had access to it. This wasn't a this is different from the Incas. The Incas did not have market systems. They did not have a commercial economy. The Inca state controlled the economy. It was a command economy. And so it's sort of whether commoners had access to valuable goods was sort of what the state sort of decided to do. Whereas in the Aztecs, people had access to a lot of goods through the market system. Would you say the family structure was communitarian, authoritarian? Well, it's sort of hard to say. I mean, we don't have direct evidence of that archaeologically, but from documents on the Aztecs, people think that within the family, there were complementary gender relationships. In other words, men had a woman and men had a role and had status for their role, and women had a complementary role and had a high status for their roles. And so there's a literature on this in the historical record on the Aztecs. Bells are Spanish. Bells are not Spanish. The jingle bells are pre-Hispanic. They're from the Tarascan realm. They're trading it from the Tarascan area. The currency, was it decentralized? Well, these things are perishable, so we don't find the actual textiles or the cacao beans. But as far as we can tell from the documentary sources, they're both very widely used. For example, descriptions of markets in various parts of the empire right after the Spanish conquest mention cotton textiles and cacao both being used to buy things in the market. There's also a reference that they counterfeited cacao beans, and there's law codes for what you do if someone used counterfeit cacao beans. And my colleague Franny Burdan at Cal State San Bernardino once did a project with her class. She gave them a bunch of cacao beans, said, figure out how you would counterfeit these. And basically, you can't. It's like, well, you can't take out an outer part of it and fill it with sawdust or something. There was no effective way to make a counterfeit cacao bean that wasn't a heck of a lot more effort than just getting these. So we don't know what whether they really did have counterfeit cacao beans or not. How do they make lime since there are so few trees? Well, lime, meaning the lime plaster. Basically, this area of Morelos is full of limestone mountains. So they would get limestone, you bake it in a big oven, and then you take the powdered lime and you mix it with water and sand, and it basically becomes cement. We call it lime plaster, but it's not. It's a cement. That's why it's lasted all these years. And it's pretty common in ancient sites throughout Mesoamerica. And it's easy to do in this area of Morelos because there's lots of limestone. The mountains around there are limestone mountains. Other questions? Heather, did I get anything wrong?
Am I unmuted?
We can
Yes.
hear you, Deb.
Okay, well, I have a question. It sounds as though these people were pretty self-sufficient in the provinces. But I was wondering, what about, there must have been at least some people who couldn't work for one reason or another, or were very ill or a result of some accident. How, what happened with those people?
Well, we don't have a lot of evidence, but everything we know suggests that households and larger social groups, or like around these patio groups, took care of their own members and also took in others, took in outsiders. One of the things these census documents show is that a lot of households took in boarders to stay with them and to work for them. And as far as we could tell, people who were either elderly or sick or couldn't work were supported within their local household or kin network. So
Dr. Smith, you mentioned Sahagun. I imagine you're familiar with the early chroniclers of Mexico. Do you find that they had an attitude towards the Aztecs as being that they are from a foreign land, or more that the chroniclers saw them as just not non-Christians, right? They were familiar with non-Christian people. Did they just look at them like they would people from North Africa, or did they see them in a totally different light?
I'm not sure I really know the answer to that. Most of the Spanish writers didn't worry too much about where they were from. I mean, some of them talked about the origins, but most of them, it wasn't really a thing they were too concerned with.
So the early chroniclers were trying to place them as far as their mindset is, like where they came from, as far as like in terms of the Bible.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the chroniclers did, and that's something I don't know. I just don't know that much about myself.
Okay.
Were there any particular arrangements within their house? I'm thinking of, the Mayans had the hearth was the center, and they had to have 3 stones placed in a certain way. And there were certain things, the direction that the houses were pointed sometimes. Were there any things like that were particularly Aztec?
One of the weird things about our excavations of these houses was that there was nothing in these houses. They didn't leave things. These things were picked clean. People, I think what happened is they were abandoned gradually. Spaniards often moved people into new settlements. And so people had time to go back to their old houses and pull the stuff out of there. Now, and when you have a quick abandonment, because people left in a hurry, they leave things around and archaeologists find them. While we were excavating this stuff and finding these houses with nothing inside except some potsherds, right up the hill is the site of Xochicalco, a major pre-Aztec urban center that was abandoned in a rush. People left Xochicalco for whatever reason to get out of there in a hurry. And they were excavating up there, and every house had, you can see the bean pot in the corner and the mano and matate, or they're grinding the corn over here. You can see how things were laid out when people used them, because they just left everything. And it was really quite incredible. And here we are finding these houses. There's nothing. And what we found in these houses is potsherds that had been incorporated into the adobe bricks and had sort of deteriorated in the houses. So we can't say much of anything about, physically how the houses were arranged inside.
A couple comments in Zoom. Longevity numbers. How long did people live?
Well, we can't judge that very well for the burials we found. If we did, we'd say this was a society of children. Most of the burials was a society of children. Most of these burials were juveniles and children. And so there were probably cemeteries that we haven't located. What was the longevity? I should probably know that, but I don't. I mean, there's been quite a bit of analysis by osteologists and bioarchaeologists, and I can't tell you right now how long people lived. Good question though.
Did they have any evidence of having chickens, or maybe a family having a cow in there? Did they have a complex with, did they have a place where they got their material for their, what is it that they dig from the ground and use when they make the tortillas?
Well, that's based on maize.
Yes,
And
it's maize and
they didn't have a lot of domesticated animals. I mean, dogs and turkeys was about it. And actually, they got a lot of the protein in the diet came from processing the maize and eating maize together with beans to create a complete protein.
And where was there evidence that they had a place outside of the house where they bathed, or
We
they had small structures close to the house?
Yeah, no, we did not find evidence for sort of outbuildings or things like that. It seems to be a single house that was inhabited by a household group, and usually there were no clear evidence for rooms within the house. It was probably a single room house, or maybe mats or perishable materials might have divided it up.
Got a few more.
Houses looked like they were pretty big.
Well, actually, the houses were not very big. The average size of a house was between 20 and 25 square meters. And that's, it's a fairly small house. In fact, that's smaller than most of the contemporary adobe houses of rural peoples today.
So that seems to be larger than the Mayan area in the Yucatan anyway.
Yeah. Oh, actually, my wife Cindy reminds me, granaries. Yes, we have some granaries that we excavated. We're not. The name Cuescomate, which is the name of the site, means granary, and it has these circular features that we think were granaries. And Cindy reminded me of that because she excavated some of these. Someone wanted to know if they could ask questions and email. Feel free to email me. My email is available, I don't know, on Twitter or ASU website or whatever.
Can I just ask a quick one?
Sure.
You said corn and beans. Is there any evidence of squash being grown?
Well, we don't. Yeah. Ethnobotanists and paleoethnobotanists have found some squash remains. I don't think we have we did in our excavations, but in
Oh,
central
okay, but there
Mexico.
has been in the area then.
Yeah,
Yeah, because it's all often grown together. Okay, thank you.
Well, Dr. Smith, I'm wondering if the homes would have been so small because did people spend a whole lot of time inside? I imagine without modern heating and air conditioning, people wouldn't have much of a reason to spend their whole day inside, except for maybe sleeping and getting out of the rain.
that's a very good point. And it's something that, that our archaeological evidence doesn't give us real clear evidence on, but I think it's very likely that a lot of activities probably took place outside. I would say probably a lot of, people, whether it's cooking or socializing or doing some crafts or a variety of things, probably took place in these little patios where you had, 3, 4 houses grouped around a common area. They kept the common area clean, we can say that. They didn't let trash build up there, and trash built up sort of behind the house and around the sides. So I would say, probably a lot of activities took place. I mean, this is, fairly warm climate. Doesn't get too hot in the summers. It doesn't get too cold in the winters. And so, a lot of activity probably took place outside.
Wonderful. Yeah, I kind of think of that myself because I'm in an old house and it really wasn't made with the idea of people spending a lot of time inside. Not even that, don't need to go that far back. Well, great. Do we have any further questions before we start tying stuff up? All right, this is one of the biggest attendances we've ever had on Zoom. So at least 75 people. So that says a lot about the speaker and the subject matter.
Well, thank you very much. These were very good questions, and I wish I was in Chicago. Chicago's a great place, and I enjoyed our time there. And I'm happy to talk to you guys. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. And
Thank you so
in
much.
closing,
It was a wonderful talk.
Okay.
in closing, I'd like to remind everybody to please join. We have wonderful speakers as we have today. And those events, those speakers would not be possible without the participation of our members. So hope you join, and hope you renew your memberships. This is the time of year to do so. So go to ChicagoArchaeologicalSociety.com. You can get info from us by sending to info@chicagoarchaeology.org. There are 2 different domains. And for the people that have already renewed their membership or joined, thank you for your support. And next time, our meeting is Olmecs and the Maya Connections, Zoom only. And then in March, we have Human Mastodon Interaction, Zoom only. But in April, we're back in person and Zoom at the Evanston Public Library. And we're going to be talking about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. All right. Anything else anybody wants to announce or say in closing here?
Well, yes, I wanted to mention, hello,
Yes.
that if they join, they get a lot of more information and other articles in the Codex.
Yes. You will get our monthly newsletter.
Yes, the monthly newsletter, and it gives more information about the future speakers, etc., and also a kind of summary and an opinion about the past one. So it's a very interesting publication to be able to have. Thank you.
Yeah. And in addition to getting membership in the Chicago Archaeological Society, you also get membership in the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. And we have chapters all over Illinois. The IAAA, as they're called, produce several publications a year, which are very valuable and contain information about archaeology being done in the state of Illinois. All right. Oh, someone's saying that they tried to email us at chicagoarchaeology.com. It's actually .org. Let me bring that back up on the screen here. So info@chicagoarchaeology.org. Great. All right. Well, I hope I see everybody at, or at least over the internet, see everybody at our next meeting about the Olmecs and the Mayas. All right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Hey,
Thanks, Dr. Smith.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.